History tells us that those with the greatest wealth hold all the levers of power firmly within their grip, and when they feel the time is right, they will move these levers in whatever direction necessary to achieve their desired ends. Throughout the ages, great wealth has purchased kingdoms, empires, and knowledge. Ancient wisdom concerning human relationship between the macrocosm, the transiting planets, and alternative forms of consciousness, both benevolent and malevolent. This fringe knowledge and forms of paranormal wisdom has promoted many of these ruling powers throughout history to push for great social changes at specific times. We are now in one of those times where the levers of power have been repositioned towards a new outcome, and those who perish during these turbulent times are just viewed as unfortunate statistics of collateral damage. This ruling cult, which we see today, have aligned themselves and their policies with the energetic characteristics of the planet Saturn, attempting to impose a satanic future for all humanity under an all-encompassing technological control grid. The few at the center of the inner circle, setting the direction of policy, are now having to interact, exposing themselves with outer circles comprising of secret societies, international corporations, and government agencies. Through the implementation of United Nations directives, they are able to bring all these organizations together to impose the will of the cult at the inner center upon the rest of humanity. Their ultimate objective is global governance, administered through local councils with the abolition of national sovereignty, removing any ability in the future for independence and self-determination. All organized opposition will be neutralized, and the minds of all future generations will regard it as their normal. At this time, they appear to have placed duplicitous, egotistical psychopaths in positions of leadership all around the world simultaneously, in an organized attempt to undermine the credibility of traditional systems of national governments. And when the time comes, when the people have had more than enough chaos, security will be removed from those leaders, and one by one they will be hung out to dry and left to those angry mobs looking for justice and revenge. Once these national governments fall, the people have to be careful they don't get maneuvered into a situation where they freely hand over the running of their affairs to the United Nations or some other central power, instead of restoring the integrity of their own traditional systems of government. In their anger and despair, they could very well be walking straight into the hands of the globalists. Like previous generations who were unaware that both mainstream capitalism and mainstream communism were controlled by this hidden cult in an attempt to manipulate the direction of humanity through the synthesis offered from the two opposing camps.
In recent months, there has been a resurgence of interest in the substance of Mr. Dodd's story, and we have decided to make it available to the general public. And so what now follows is the full, unedited interview, broken occasionally only for a tape change or to omit the sound of a passing airplane. It stands on its own as an important piece in the puzzle of modern history. Mr. Dodd, let's begin this interview by a brief statement for the record, telling us who you are, what your background is, and your qualifications to speak on this subject.
Well, Mr. Griffin, as for who I am just, as the name implies, an individual born in New Jersey and educated in private schools, eventually in a school called Andover, Massachusetts, and then Yale University, and running through my whole period of being brought up and growing up, I have been an indefatigable reader, and I have had one major interest, and that was this country, as I was led to believe it was originally founded. And I entered the world of business knowing absolutely nothing about how that world operated, and realized that the only way to find out what that world was consisted of would be to become part of it. And I then acquired some experience in the manufacturing world, and then in the world of international communication, and finally chose banking as the field I wish to devote my life to. And I was fortunate enough to secure a position in one of the important banks in New York, and lived there. I lived through the conditions which led up to what is known as the crash of 1929, and I witnessed what is tantamount to a collapse of the structure of the United States as a whole. And much to my surprise, I was confronted by my superiors with in the middle of the panic in which they were immersed, I was confronted with the question, Norm, what do we do now? I was 30 at the time, and I had no more right to have an answer to that question than the man in the moon. However, I did manage to say to my superiors, gentlemen, you take this experience as proof of something that you do not know about banking, and you better go find out what that something is and act accordingly. 4 days later, I was confronted by the same superiors with a statement to the effect that, Norm, you go find out. And I really was fool enough to accept that assignment, because it meant that you were going out to search for something and nobody could tell you what you were looking for. But I felt so strongly on the subject that I consented to. I was relieved of all normal duties inside the bank, and 2.5 years later, I felt that it was possible to report back to those who had given me this assignment. And so I rendered such a report, and as a result of the report I rendered, I was told the following: Norm, what you're saying is we should return to sound banking. And I said, yes, in essence, that's exactly what I'm saying. Whereupon I got my first shock, which was a statement from them to this effect: we will never see sound banking in the United States again. And they cited chapter and verse to support that statement. And what they cited was as follows: since the end of World War I, we have been responsible for what they call the institutionalizing of conflicting interests. And they are so prevalent inside this country that they can never be resolved. This came to me as an extraordinary shock, because the men who made the statement were men who were deemed as the most prominent bankers in the country. The bank of which I was a part was spoken of as a Morgan bank. And coming from men of that caliber, a statement of that kind made a tremendous impression on me. And the type of impression that it made on me was, I wondered if I, as an individual and it's what they call a junior officer of the bank, could, with the same enthusiasm, foster the progress and the policies of the bank. I spent about a year trying to think this out, and came to the conclusion that I would have to resign. I did resign, and as a consequence of that, had this experience. When my letter of resignation reached the desk of the president of the bank, he sent for me. And then I came to visit with him, and he stated to me, Norm, I have your letter, but I don't believe you understand what's happened in the last 10 days. And I said, no, Mr. Cochran, I have no idea what's happened. Well, he said, the directors have never been able to get your report to them out of their mind. And as a result, they have decided that you, as an individual, must begin at once, and you must reorganize this bank in keeping with your own ideas. And he then said, now, can I tear up your letter? And inasmuch as what had been said to me was offering me, at the age of, by then, 33, about as fine an opportunity for service to the country as I could imagine, I said yes. And they said they wished me to begin at once. And I did, and suddenly, in the span of about 6 weeks, I was not permitted to do another piece of work. And every time I brought the subject up, I was kind of patted on the back and said, and told, stop worrying about it, Norm. Pretty soon you'll be a vice president, and then you will have quite a handsome salary, and ultimately be able to retire on a very worthwhile pension. In the meantime, you can play golf and tennis to your heart's content on weekends. Well, Mr. Griffin, I found I couldn't do it. I spent a year with figuratively with my feet on the desk doing nothing, and I just couldn't adjust to it. So I did resign. And this time, my resignation stuck, and then I got my second shock, which was the discovery that the doors of every bank in the United States were closed to me, and I never could get a job, as it were, in a bank. So I found myself for the first time since I'd graduated from college, out of a job.
At what point in your career did you become connected with the Reese Committee?
1953.
1953.
Yeah.
And what was that capacity, sir?
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reese Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reese Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American without, I might say, defining what they meant by un-American. But that was the resolution, and the committee had then the task of selecting a council, and the council in turn had the task of selecting a staff, and he had to have somebody who would direct the work of that staff. And that was what they meant by the Director of Research.
What were some of the details, the specifics that you told the committee at that time?
Well, Mr. Griffin, in that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American. And we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means. We have plenty of constitutional procedures, assuming that we wish to effect a change in the form of government or that sort of thing. And therefore, any effort in that direction which did not avail itself of the procedures which were authorized by the Constitution could be justifiably called un-American.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we are here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair in response to a letter which I had written to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, asking certain questions and gathering certain information. And on the arrival of that letter, Dr. Johnson, who was then president of the Carnegie Endowment, telephoned me and said, did I ever come up to New York? And I said, yes, I did, more or less each weekend. And he said, well, when you're next here, will you drop in and see us? Which I did. And again, on arrival at the office of the endowment, I found myself in the presence of Dr. Joseph Johnson, the president, who was a successor to Alger Hiss, two vice presidents, and their own counsel, a partner in the firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And Dr. Johnson said, after, again, amenities, Mr. Dodd, we have your letter. We can answer all those questions, but it'd be a great deal of trouble. And we have a counter-suggestion. And our counter-suggestion is that if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send that member up to New York, we will give to that member a room in the library and the minute books of this foundation since its inception. And we think that whatever you want to find out or the Congress wants to find out will be obvious from those minutes. Well, my first reaction was they lost their mind. I had a pretty good idea of what those minutes would contain, but I realized that Dr. Johnson had only been in office 2 years, and the vice presidents were relatively young men, and counsel seemed to be also a young man, and I guessed that probably they'd never read the minutes themselves. And so I said I had somebody, I would take it. I would accept their offer, and I went back to Washington, and I selected the member of my staff who was on my staff, having been a practicing attorney in Washington, but she was on my staff to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or rules. In addition to which, she was unsympathetic to the purpose of the investigation. She was level-headed and a very reasonably brilliant, capable lady. And her attitude toward the investigation was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, in the face of that sincere conviction of Catherine's, I went out of my way not to prejudice her in any way. But I did explain to her that she couldn't possibly cover 50 years of handwritten minutes in 2 weeks. So she would have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods of time to concentrate on. And off she went to New York. She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, But I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally, they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association.
The timing of this great reset is in line with a change in planetary rulership over this new time period, along with transiting influences throughout specific parts of the world. They know that the United States will be heavily affected by both the 84-year revolutionary cycle of Uranus and its Pluto return over the next few years. Consequently, they want to be the ones at the helm of its controlled demolition in order to come out holding onto all the levers of power while using the opportunity to reset the world in their image.
It is obvious that we are in the midst of the most severe crisis the world has experienced since World War II. 75 years ago, countries and people came together to shape the post-war global order, which brought us decades of peace, increased global cooperation, and prosperity to hundreds of millions of people around the world. The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era. We have a choice to remain passive, which would lead to the amplification of many of the trends we see today: polarization, nationalism, racism, and ultimately increased social unrest and conflicts. But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract, particularly integrating the next generation. We can change our behavior to be in harmony with nature again. And we can make sure that the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are best utilized to provide us with better lives. In short, we need a great reset.
Many unaware of the bigger picture unfolding through systems of compartmentalization are being used as useful servants to this satanic cult, operating outside public scrutiny at the center of a web, using the corporate structure as a mechanism to control humanity. All big ideas throughout history have been big disasters, resulting in larger government intervention and control, imposing an inhumane, one-size-fits-all agenda on the natural diversity of all peoples. The worst form of inequality is to try to make unequal things equal. Aristotle. They say a camel is a horse designed by a committee, and the greater the size of government control, the more restrictions are placed on the individual, limiting their ability to become the greatest version of themselves, and to experience this world and all its diversity as the Creator intended. The hubris arrogance of these people to trample over our freedoms in their attempt to entangle us within a web of corporate policies, making themselves wealthy in the process as they work together to erode our health and freedoms, can no longer be tolerated. The reason why most of us were born in a world with many of our freedoms and liberties still intact was because all previous tyrannical systems and big ideas of control have failed. This one will be no different. The will of the human spirit to be free as intended by their Creator is non-negotiable, and those who think they can impose a contrary will are playing a dangerous game. In time, they will ultimately reap a divine retribution where no spirit or entity can save them. As with all tyrants, they will be ripped from the living and cast into the putrid waste of dark history.